Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. In today's video, we're going to be continuing the year-long journey we're on doing an archetypal analysis into the 13 great feasts of the Orthodox Christian Liturgical Year. It's my prayer that this journey will help us accelerate the pace of our spiritual evolution and our spiritual development and help us perhaps spiral deeper and deeper into our hearts. Today I'll be talking with in the upcoming interview with Seraphim Winslow about the Nativity of the Theotokos. This is a celebration of the birth of the Blessed Mother of God, known as Mary. During this chat, we'll be covering numerous topics that will help us on the spiritual journey. Just some things that jumped out to me as particularly notable were overcoming the psychology of instant gratification, aligning with deep spiral and cyclical archetypes that are really fundamental to the human experience, how Mary the Theotokos is an exemplar and guide to attain heightened states of spiritual purity, and also how we can let go of attachment to outcome. Now, Seraphim really offers an overwhelming, in a great way, an overwhelming and delicious feast of wisdom in this chat. So I did create a glossary that you can access via Google Doc, which will be underneath this in the description of this video. Some terms like epictasis, karma yoga, rosa mystica, involution, the omega point, the eschaton, and the eternal return of the same, which he mentions. We can use this doc to kind of dive deeper into those terms and integrate them after this interview ends, or after we're done listening. So thanks so much for watching. We'll get into the interview now, and I hope you have a really awesome rest of your evening and enjoy the interview. All right. All right. Hi, everyone. Hey, Seraphim. How are you doing today? Hey, really excited to be here chatting with you. Thanks so much for joining me today for this chat on the Nativity of the Theotokos. Before we jump in and dive into the meat of the interview, I just want to give a brief introduction for Seraphim. Seraphim is someone who I'm really grateful to have met, has really shared a lot of incredible wisdom with me when it comes to the non-dual understanding of the Orthodox faith in particular, and the Christian faith, as well as his incredible comparative religious project. Also, I highly suggest checking out some of his work online, on Facebook, on the internet, and then also the mystery school that he runs.
Wisdom School.
I'm sorry, the Wisdom School that he runs.
Wisdom School, yeah.
The Wisdom School that he runs. Actually, with that, Seraphim, do you want to say any more, add any more context about your journey and your teaching experiences?
No, I think you touched the main points.
Okay, great. Okay, so I was wondering if we could start today's chat with a little bit of like the context. So we've done a talk before on Advent, and we're now going to kind of systematically work through the liturgical year. The great feasts. Right. And what I was just curious, why would a spiritual seeker or you or me, why would someone be interested in going through the liturgical year? Like, what would an intention be, or kind of the why, if that makes sense? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So in our society, American society, we look a lot for instant gratification. So a lot of people who are spiritual seekers will kind of think, oh, if I go on this weekend retreat, or if I take this pill, or if I listen to this series of lectures, I'm going to get it. I'm going to get the enlightenment, or whatever it is they're seeking spiritually. And the whole intent behind the liturgical year is actually kind of works against that whole psychology of instant gratification, because the assumption in the liturgical year is, at the very least, the bare minimum of spiritual awakening or insight, you're only going to be able to arrive at after journeying at least an entire year, contemplating the various archetypes, the various symbols, the various holy events that occurred in the life of these exceptional people that are associated with the church. And only after that first year, moving all the way from the beginning of the year, which like in the Jewish religion, the beginning of the Orthodox year is September 1st. So we begin the year September 1st, and we go all through the year. And remember, again, there's two calendars in the Orthodox Church. There's a fixed calendar and a moving calendar. So the fixed calendar is attached to the solar calendar, and the movable feast, the moving calendar, is attached to the date of Pascha, which is a lunar. It's a lunar holiday. So as you move between these two cycles of the solar and lunar, and especially as you pass through the great feast of Pascha, which is in the spring, only then can it really begin to dawn on you what spiritual life is all about. So it's kind of like moving spiritually through the Orthodox liturgical year it's the antidote to an instant gratification spirituality.
Awesome. That's really resonating with me, Seraphim, about, yeah, there's definitely there can be an impulse. I definitely feel that in my experience to kind of jump from one thing to the other. And so we're talking here about a kind of fidelity to a particular practice or a particular set of symbols. In this case, right, we're looking at the kind of the Christian story as refracted through the Orthodox faith in particular. And so you were talking about kind of fidelity. And then also I was just making this kind of connection, just maybe I could do a quick check for understanding, kind of maybe an interesting association, but I was thinking as you're talking about permaculture, which I've been studying recently, and some permaculture theorists talk that before you even plant, you could just kind of sit and meditate and watch the land for an entire year. And so that was really, do you think we're tracking there with that kind of
totally.
that kind of analogy? Okay.
Yeah, there are so many, agricultural, cosmological, astrological connections. Yeah, whereas in the Western Church, especially the Catholic and Protestant Church, a lot of the metaphors and discourse you'll find is centered around legalities, notions of punishment and judgment. Most of the metaphors that we tend to use and most of the discourse that our language centers around really does go back to things like agriculture, astrology, the position of the stars, the moon, and the sun, all of those things. So in relating, these ideas to agriculture, you are not far from wisdom.
Great. Awesome. And maybe that's a good segue into another thing that was coming up for me when you were talking. I definitely had a ping of like the astrological and the agriculture. Yeah. However, as we have talked about a little bit, you have I think a really important distinction with your kind of archetypal reading, with like Christ being the antitype and we as
the archetype. Christ is the archetype.
Oh, I'm sorry. Christ is the archetype. And then and remind me of what the human like anthropology is in that. So we are.
So you looking back at the Old Testament, we have foreshadowings, which you could call types or prototypes. Actually, I'm developing kind of a new language since we last spoke, and I'm tending now to talk less about archetypes and more about archetypes, because I'm starting to see the way kind of the events are not just the events in, like, for example, Holy Sacred History are not static symbols the way they're envisioned, for example, in Jungian psychology or other pursuits that use archetypes. I see them more as literary tropes, so that if we're looking back at literary tropes in the Old Testament, we can see many of the people and events there as kind of proto-tropes or simply tropes that culminate in the grand symbology of Christ as the archetype of the self, which we now then in this kind of, you could call it the Messianic age, right? These years after Christ, in which Christians or Christ's anointed ones are supposed to carry on that legacy. We are the allotropes of this great archetype. So yeah, since we've talked last, I'm wanting to talk much more about tropes rather than types. That's kind of a change since we last spoke.
Awesome. And I think that's very much in the spirit of our project, with the integral understanding, it's not necessarily static, things are developing, and of course you as a teacher are developing. So I think that's really interesting. I'm excited to kind of integrate some more of that that language. Maybe this is a good time to plug this resource list that I've been putting together to kind of hold on and integrate some of your teachings, and so we'll throw that integrate some of that and throw some of those definitions in that Google Doc. So that's very interesting.
Great idea.
Yeah. And so kind of circling back to the liturgical year thing. So we're talking maybe a little bit about agriculture, astrology. Many wheel of the year type systems use that, but in this particular project, we're working with Christ, right? Like the symbol of Christ. So like, what do you think about kind of aligning with that story, and does that align with this kind of embodying the trope, the archetype of Christ in our everyday experience? Do you see it like that?
Definitely. So I like also that you use the language of circling back, because one pattern that has been really kind of forgotten, I think, even by Orthodox Christians, but which was extremely important in the whole cosmovision of the early church fathers. And I'm thinking particularly of the church father, St. Gregory of Nyssa. St. Gregory of Nyssa spoke of epiktasis, and that's another term we can put in the Google Doc. But this epiktasis kind of works against the familiar pattern of the way history works itself out, the way we've been taught. Because, usually I think a lot of the times when people are learning religious history, philosophical history, they hear about things like, Judeo-Christian theory of time is a theory of time that's about having a beginning and an end, whereas the previous, ancient or pagan or, kind of Greco-Roman understanding was that time was circular. And I think that actually both of those models don't harmoniously fit with what we understand in the Orthodox Church in the mystical sense, in which, Christ kind of fits in to this whole pattern of the liturgical year moving and progressing through spiritual life. So rather than history progressing from a beginning to an end in linear fashion or in kind of this, circular fashion, we really speak about the progress of history and humanity and spiritual progress in terms of the spiral. And it's moving in this spiral pattern through each liturgical year, in which we see both sameness and variation as we grow, as we increase, that this kind of organic quality of the life of life in Christ really comes in the flesh. So this epiktasis, this was the term that Saint Gregory of Nyssa used, and he's well known for this phrase, moving from glory to glory. And so this pattern of spiritual growth of our life in Christ, which we begin by living through the feast days of the spiritual year, which begins on earth, that earthly life is only a kind of a narthex, which is the front part of a church. It's like the foyer of a church. So it's only the entrance to this great kind of cathedral of eternal life that we will continue on in the next life, in which we're going to continue on spirally growing spiritually from glory to glory. And so I think if I were to qualify the life in Christ for an Orthodox Christian as we move through that liturgical year, the pattern of that spiral and that infinite, eternal, perpetual growth is a really relevant feature that people often forget even today.
Awesome. So is it the epic, how do we say that word again? From St. Gregory?
Epiktasis.
Epiktasis. Very provocative idea. I think this kind of circling back, which makes a lot of sense to me intuitively, but I'm glad to get some language and some conceptual ideas around it. And I think I'm wondering, so we talked about from glory to glory, and you brought in an interesting idea of maybe a kind of macrocosmic incarnational cycle with our souls. And then we also have the feasts. I'm wondering, just as a quick check for understanding and to maybe make this really concrete. So I'm wondering if this circling also, before we kind of align with this, the 13 great, the feast, the 12 great feasts in Pascha, thinking of it on like a developmental level, like,
Yeah.
so I'm hearing like echoes of my life almost. It seems like sometimes things kind of circle, and not always in the most positive way, things that can be kind of negative. And so do you see it like that? Do you think like on a kind of unconscious level this can play out, and potentially like aligning with the year of the year, like a kind of a more how do I want to say this, like a more unitive or a more archetypally positive, if that makes sense, frame of reference could be helpful for something like that, like if you find yourself in a kind of more negative recurring patterns. Is anything coming up for you as
Yeah, well, with the integral model, which invokes the developmental psychology that you're referring to, you will find that as you move through the liturgical year, let's take the feast day that we're going to talk about today, which is the Nativity of the Theotokos, which takes place on the new calendar. We have two calendars in the Orthodox Church, one called the old, one called the new. The new calendar just took place. It was on September 8th, but the old calendar, it's still to come, September 21st. Anyway, you will find that you are a different person developmentally from year to year on that particular feast day. So the feast day, let's say, of the Nativity of the Theotokos, in which you are remembering all of the hymnography that you heard in church, all of the symbology, all of the iconography, the various associations that you make spiritually with all of that symbology on that particular feast day in one year is going to be a mark for you to see how you've grown spiritually the next year when you arrive at that time. Because if you've been doing spiritual work in an earnest and conscientious and committed way, there's no doubt that even though the feast day is the same on September 8th, you're a different person developmentally. And you're going to be able to track that spiritual progress because you're going to be able to compare your inner state to where you are today with where you were last time when you were looking at those icons or hearing that iconography or whatever comes up in the liturgy. They're going to be like triggers for you to remember, oh yeah, I was like this last year, but now I'm doing this year. And this is how I've grown from year to year to year developmentally. So just in my life, I'm 54 now. I became Orthodox when I was 25. And, only by virtue of the fact that I can track my spiritual progress through the symbology of the hymnography, the iconography of each particular holiday, those have been like signposts along the way, or road markers by which I've been able to see my spiritual progress. Most traditions, especially a lot of anti-iconic traditions or aniconic traditions, in which people try to downplay symbology, because they're very minimalist, it's very hard to track spiritual progress because you don't have any what T.S. Eliot called objective correlative. Okay, T.S. Eliot spoke in poetry about an objective correlative to a poetic emotion or feeling. So poetic emotions and feelings, very much like spiritual states, are very evanescent. You can't put your fingers on them. And so Eliot spoke in his poetry about an objective correlative where he would bring up a symbol in a poem which corresponded objectively to one of these evanescent feelings that you can't put your finger on. That's exactly what's happening in the symbology, hymnography, and iconography of the liturgical year. Is the spiritual seeker has objective correlatives of symbols that you can look at objectively and say, oh yes, I remember when I was looking at that icon last year, I was in a very different spiritual state that I am today. And there's a great evidence for a developmental model of spirituality.
Yeah, it's really helpful. I'm glad to it's cool that it sounds like there's a lot of like literary stuff coming through right now. Like we're talking about T.S. Eliot and like archetypes too. That's really interesting. And not to make this before we jump into the Nativity of the Theotokos, maybe just one more question here on some of the circling idea and the developmental model. I think what we're speaking about, it seems pretty radical to me, especially kind of circling back to what you had said about maybe a misconception we can sometimes have about like Hebrew time versus pagan time.
Right.
Like the linear and the cyclical, and maybe unify those perspectives. I'm wondering if there's like like almost like a modern bias, like a modern hierarchical bias, where we tend to see maybe like instead of that circling model, it's like, I've left behind that stage and I'm kind of here now. And I found that, do you find it can be helpful and maybe a bit liberating to be able to circle back through stages and then, as you were just talking about, like this idea of just being able to remember stuff is very, very powerful. And so I don't know, are you seeing a unification of maybe the developmental kind of more linear evolutionary model and a kind of more broadly speaking like pagan, or even cycles are big in Hinduism and in other systems as well? Do you see your approach being a unification of them, or is that too simple?
Yeah, I wouldn't call it unification so much as an integration.
Got it.
It's definitely integrating. Well, we see just in the simple geometry of a spiral, how a spiral is both a line and a circle. And we see how a spiral is a beautiful integration of circular and linear movement. And I think it's this intuition, this integral intuition into the true nature of time that was one of the great gifts of Christianity. Because, with the strictly linear model, there was a kind of cosmological flatland, and you spoke of you just kind of mentioned a hierarchical bias. I wouldn't call it so much a hierarchical bias that really keeps us from seeing the wisdom of this insight of spiral development. I would see it more as an anti-sacramental bias, because the real difference between, I think, the spiral model of epictasis and both the linear and circular developments is both in linear and circular history, you don't have a lot of transcendence. There's no possible way to kind of break the patterns of entropy that have us trapped. Whereas the spiral cycle of epictasis, it's a real kind of anti-entropic process that draws on the energies of something we spoke of last time, which was the energy of involution. So it's really involutionary energy, which is pulling the human spirit forward into this spiral pattern, kind of going into eternity forward. Going back to our literary analogies, it was W.B. Yeats. William Butler Yeats spoke of this concept. He was a great one for being involved in a lot of various occult movements. And he was a member, or probably, I think, a founder of the Golden Dawn at some point. But he wrote a book called, what was it called? Spirals or something like that, in which he laid out his occult theory of history. And he spoke about gyres, okay? And I think if you read Yeats' poetry, you're going to come across gyres all the time. Well, the first line of the second coming is turning and turning in this widening gyre. The falcon cannot hear the falconer. So this gyre, this spiral involution coming from the future, which is associated with what some occultists call the Great Year. This is the very spiral energy of epictasis, pulling the human spirit toward the eschaton. That is, toward the great teleological moment of awakening that awaits us in the future. One of the reasons we always end prayers in the Orthodox Church with the word, both now and ever and unto the ages of ages, is because this involution is always meeting us here, right here in the present moment where we are, and drawing us to a higher reality, epictasically, into that eschaton, toward that more meaningful future.
Yeah, and just talking about this involution, this idea, I find it very, like, maybe paradoxically liberating, because I feel like maybe so just to kind of call out where we're at historically, we're at what I look at as late modernity. Some people call it postmodernity. We've had a long history of kind of final causes, teleology. It's not something that's in the discourse very, very much, and people like we love free will, etc. And like mechanical causation or formal causation is like all the rage. Embracing this idea of being pulled forward by beauty or by love or by truth, it feels more freeing, in a sense, just qualitatively. I'm wondering, maybe segueing into the Nativity of the Theotokos, just practically, personally, I'm thinking of this working as feeling pulled towards, whatever the highest aim for this working is for myself. Just kind of, it's kind of a subtle thing, but is that kind of how you see the involution? Maybe just talking, what is the experience of teleology like?
Yeah,
that's a big question.
Well, eschatology is simply teleology baptized. Like, you spoke of this mechanical teleology, and that's what teleology exactly is when you don't include the element of the transcendent or the sacred. But when you baptize it, when it's kind of infused with this sacred energy, in which the ultimate object at the end of time is not just some kind of, depersonalized, inhuman or transhuman mark, but it is actually the very creator and God, which, gives us immanently life, then that mechanical teleology becomes a holy sacred eschatology, and everything that appears to be something like that's either fate or destiny or something that we're predetermined to actually becomes exactly what you mentioned. It becomes a liberational moment, because at that time, when you can say yes to the destiny that's been predestined to you, because one of the things that the Calvinists got right, Calvinists talk a lot about predestination, and a lot of people kind of, badmouth the Calvinists for this, but predestination is exactly correct, but it's not predestination to any, heaven or hell. Everyone eventually is predestined to glory, to heaven. But the point is, are you going to get there by the path of pain, or are you going to get there by the path of consciousness? And, unfortunately, we look around us, and most people are living out their destinies through the path of pain. And what the offer is for something like the celebrating the liturgical year and having a conscious, awakened spiritual life, the invitation is actually to follow the path of consciousness and be awakened to the glory that you're predestined to. So you don't get there kicking and screaming, as it were. You go there, with this great triumphant affirmation. You're, like Nietzsche, Nietzsche talked about the eternal return. And in Nietzsche's eternal return, the idea is that if these patterns in your life are going to repeat over and over and over all throughout eternity, you'd better learn to say yes to them. Otherwise, you're going to have a hell of a time. And I think, there's a lot of things that we can disagree with in the Orthodox Church with Nietzsche, but I think he got that right. I think there's a certain sense in which when you say yes to your life, to whatever happens in your life, most of the things of which, almost all the things, you can't choose. You didn't choose your gender, you didn't choose your nationality, you didn't choose your situation. You don't even actually really choose. Scientists are already showing you don't choose the thoughts you're thinking, that the thoughts that are coming up in your mind can be predicted 10 seconds in advance. So there's nothing in life that you really choose, but there is one thing that you do have free will in, and that's to say yes to whatever's happening. But if you say no, if you constantly kick at the pricks and balk at what's happening to you, well, you've then set yourself on the road to hell rather than heaven, because the road to heaven is saying yes all the way to the beautiful things God has predestined for you. And hell is simply rejecting them and saying, I don't like this, I want something else. In fact, the very definition of suffering, what is suffering? Suffering is the desire to have some situation other than the one you're in. And people cause so much suffering by saying no to the situations they've been given to say yes to.
Yeah, I definitely hear that with the suffering. Like, of course, so much of what you're saying is so rich, which is to reflect on that last part I'm hearing. I mean, do you see this kind of like the Buddha does, like craving and aversion, saying no And then also this kind of weird thing that I find myself doing sometimes is when something feels really good to like want more, you know, like craving an aversion. And it's just like, this is a beautiful moment. Just experience this beauty fully. And then also we're talking about, I think this thing, I just kind of want to linger on it a little bit because I think it's so kind of delicious and beautiful. And also kind of like almost like a Zen Cone. This idea of, so one of my favorite thinkers is David Bentley Hart, another.
Oh yeah, he's a great writer, probably the best writer in Orthodoxy today.
Yeah, and he
or,
often,
or in all of Christianity.
yeah, absolutely. And he often will talk about this concept of what he calls libertarian free will. And
right.
like this idea of you want like 1,000 different choices of bread versus like an experience of love, of truth, of transcendent love. Like it's not freedom to say no to love, to have a bunch of arbitrary choices. I think it's very like almost unconsciously there's a bias towards just I can do whatever I want, and that is called freedom.
That's actually slavery.
Yeah,
because you're enslaved to whatever you want, and whatever you want becomes your master. So doing whatever I want is exactly the opposite of freedom. It's pure slavery.
Yeah, and just I think taking that insight and lingering on it, especially like with like to bring it kind of full circle with, I'm gonna, you know, if someone in the audience right now wants to really commit to, there's this entirely modern concept called like FOMO, fear of missing out.
Yeah, right.
And it's like, what will I miss spending an entire year with one practice or something? I definitely experience that, and I'm really trying to commit to something like that, because I do think that is like true liberation, or what feels to me as a more, maybe I should say, what feels to me as a more liberating idea. And I don't know if there's anything you want to respond to there, Seraphim, or if you want to kind of take us into the Nativity of the Theotokos, maybe saying a little bit about this moment in time that we find ourselves. And we're like in this great period where we're right in between the two calendars when you and I are speaking. I'm not sure when this exactly will be released, maybe the day of, maybe a few days before. Or maybe we'll talk a little bit about the exact timing that the audience will be seeing it. And who knows when people are seeing it after that, but we find ourselves in this interesting time. Is there anything that is really present for you when it comes to this particular feast that we're marking together?
Well, to segue into the from the topic of the liturgical year to the Nativity of Theotokos, one meditation teacher that I know speaks of the process of meditation in a really beautiful, interesting way that can be applied to both the liturgical year and the Theotokos, one of whose appellations is the rose, right? The great rose, the rose of the world, Rosa Mundi. Or you can think of a roseate window with the 12 different petals on a Gothic cathedral. So this meditation teacher I'm speaking of, he says that, you know, when you sit down to meditation, think about it as a flower. You're actually growing a flower. And the center of the flower is that pure silence and openness and emptiness that you're aiming for in your meditation. Now, that emptiness that you begin with as you sit is inevitably going to be distracted and thrown off by different thoughts that come into your mind. And as the thoughts come into your mind, that starts to grow a little petal that, you know, kind of departs from that center. And maybe you go off thinking about what you're going to have for dinner that night or something somebody said. And then at the kind of peak of the petal, you think to yourself, oh, actually, I'm supposed to be meditating. So you return back to that center and that emptiness. And then you sit in that emptiness for a few more moments, but then something else comes up and you begin to grow another petal and you start having nostalgic moments about the past, or you start daydreaming and another little petal is grown. But then you remember, oh, wait, no, I'm supposed to be meditating. Go back to the center. And the whole course of a meditation session, let's say you're sitting for 20 minutes that day or an hour, is you're growing these little petals of distraction and return, distraction and return, distraction and return. All right, well, this is what the liturgical year is offering the contemplative Orthodox Christian throughout the year. Because where that center is, of course, the center is the great holy feast day of Pascha. And Pascha represents spiritual resurrection. That resurrection, it comes from the empty tomb. And that empty tomb, that is that emptiness. What's that called? In Greek, it's called kenosis. So it's the emptiness of the soul that we return to. And it's why the celebration of Easter or Pascha is at the center of the year, because it's that emptiness of death from which Christ resurrects that we begin. But when we begin the journey of meditation throughout the year, we begin at that September 1st date. And then with the Nativity of the Theotokos, we have this Nativity on September 8th, Nativity being a birth. And that birth of the Theotokos that represents the birth of this attempt at spiritual contemplative life. So you begin to grow that flower, and instead of kind of getting distracted in all kinds of personal thoughts, what your contemplation is, or what that little petal is, it consists of the various contemplations that were given by the church in its hymnography. So if you go to an Orthodox church, you're going to spend about 3 hours immersed in various references, poetic references to the Theotokos or to whatever holy figures are there. And those are given to you as objects of contemplation rather than the common distractions you have in life. Now, if you're standing in the church service, let's say the service for the Theotokos or the Exaltation of the Cross, which is the next feast day, you will find yourself distracted by thoughts the same way you would be in meditation. But the point is, with this, hymnography that you're surrounded by, is that's supposed to return you again back to these holy archetypes upon which your mind is actually supposed to be settled. Now, if you continue this journey, if you do this again and again and again, and you come back every Sunday, and you come back every feast day, and you return and return and return, this spiritual process begins to sink and settle into you. And so the Nativity of the Theotokos is the very first step that you make. And there's an interesting kind of symbolic function that the Theotokos, or the Mother of God, as we call her in the Orthodox Church, she serves a very important function that I don't think many people are aware of. And that is, there was a difference in the Jewish religion between the dichotomy of sin and righteousness on the one hand, and the dichotomy of purity versus impurity. Many people, when they read the old purity laws in the Old Testament, and they hear about things that are like, it's impure, for example, to mix wool and linen. It's impure to eat shrimp or pork. It's impure to touch a corpse. There are all these impurity laws that people are offended by when they read the Old Testament. And the reason they're offended by them is because people are conflating the idea of purity with the idea of sin, okay? Sinfulness is not impurity. Impurity is an archetype or a symbol of lack of spiritual awareness. And it's that lack of spiritual awareness in which, when your mind becomes impure, it doesn't mean you have a dirty mind or a sinful mind. What it means is you've fallen away into distraction. You don't have that pure, concentrated focus on the present moment at hand. And all of those ancient purity laws, they were just kind of ancient symbols addressing people who were thinking only on the mythological level, so that people can kind of get this idea of purity in their minds. So when we speak, for example, the Catholic Church made a big deal in the 19th century about the Theotokos being born without sin. And they even made up a doctrine for this, which many people confuse with the doctrine of the virgin birth. They called it the Immaculate Conception. The Immaculate Conception is not the virgin birth. These are two totally different things. First of all, the Immaculate Conception is the notion that Mary was born without sin. And it was this made-up doctrine that the Catholics made a big legal deal of. We could go off on a whole tangent about what that's all about. But the point of Mary being born pure is not that she was born sinless, she was born pure. So Mary's purity is not about sinfulness or original sin, which is another fake made-up doctrine, which has nothing to do with reality. What it has to do with is two spiritual states, one having to do with morality that is your own personal relationship to yourself, which depends on having a pure state of mind, and the other having to do with ethics and your relationship with other people, kind of that ethical principle. And that's kind of covered by Christ. That's what's meant by sin. And we say what Christ was born without sin. That's more of an emphasis on the ethical, social qualities. Whereas Mary's purity, that's more of an emphasis on these moral inner qualities about the purity of one's mind.
Very cool, very cool. That's okay. So that's really interesting. So first of all, just to reflect, I'm really loving this beautiful image you offered us about the flower, like in meditation, and applying that. So yeah, there's something about, like, maybe to talk about some of my more favorite Catholics, like Father Tom, or not Father Thomas Keating, the great
Thomas Keating, right? Yeah. Yep.
He really emphasizes in the centering prayer meditation that return it's not about getting distracted, it's about the return that is really beautiful. And I love that image you're giving of the return is beautiful. It's not, distraction isn't something to repress, or it's something to really, like, oh, I'm distracted, I'm coming back, and it creates this flower of emptiness. It's very, very beautiful image. So thank you for offering that, and we can apply that maybe to our work, with maybe in a very self-compassionate, loving way, like, I've been distracted the last week, but I'm coming back to my practice now, and that is beautiful. They're coming back, and through this mandala of the year that we have, there's so many opportunities to come back, and so that's really beautiful. And then secondly, so thank you for offering that. And secondly, this very interesting distinction with maybe when we're working with this particular feast, this idea of purity, and like a concentrated mind. I'm wondering if I've been studying a lot of the Gita material, the Bhagavad. I always butcher that name, but like the Krishna teaching, and there's like this karma. Anyways, I'm butchering the name because I need to practice my Sanskrit, but it's essentially, my understanding of it is this action without
without expectation of outcome.
Yeah, it's so beautiful. So would you associate that idea with purity at all?
Absolutely. The essence of the Bhagavad Gita is karma yoga. And the essence of karma yoga is acting in such a way in which you're not expecting any pleasure, reward, or gratification from the outcome, because you found the secret of the joy of this moment. And this is something that's, well, this is a great mystery, because the events in our lives to which we are predestined, God has endowed with a treasure, which we cannot find if we're distracted into seeking some other goal other than knowing the mystery and purport of this moment, which is exactly the revelation of Krishna to Arjuna on the battlefield of Kurukshetra in the Bhagavad Gita. He was saying, Krishna, Arjuna, stop getting distracted by all these dreams and thoughts of what you think the outcome is going to be. Stay with this moment, okay? Jesus is saying the same thing. So many passages I could go to in the New Testament to show where Jesus is endorsing karma yoga in the exact same way that Krishna is endorsing karma yoga to Arjuna at Kurukshetra. It's parallel, but people don't see it, because when people go to the Bible, when people go to the New Testament and the Gospels, they want to read their own prefabricated messages of what they learned in Sunday school about what they think Jesus is saying. If we could actually go to the New Testament the way we go to the Bhagavad Gita, as if it's this foreign text, so many of those revelations that are given in world religions, like, for example, the Gita and the Tao Te Ching, the Talmud, the surahs of the Quran, so much of that would open up to us, but we're sunk, we're immersed, and we're drowning in all of our cooked up notions of what we think the truth and what reality are. So what meditation and prayer are supposed to do is they're supposed to liberate us from that. They're supposed to defamiliarize our whole familiarity with the tradition. And this is a kind of difficult dance, and especially in a very traditional church like the Orthodox Church, because on the one hand, the liturgy and the services, they're supposed to shake up your your kind of precocious notions of what you think reality is. But on the other hand, because it's a tradition, it's been carried on for so many years, it's very easy to get stuck in a rut of the familiar patterns. So that's why you have not only a kind of documented tradition or a textual tradition, you also have an oral tradition, which hopefully puts you in contact with kind of a living example of the tradition, who can keep waking you up and keep showing you not to get stuck in the patterns that people usually get stuck in when they get stuck in traditionalism. Such teachers are very hard to come by now. You know, we're descending into a very dark age now, where much of religion is just becoming fundamentalist cliche, and the whole life of a real living tradition is being lost. So you should probably be very grateful whenever you find a person who's willing to awaken you to these living patterns, you know, in traditional practice.
Yeah, absolutely. That kind of sense of gratitude, I think, for the teacher is, yeah, again, kind of circling back to this free will thing. And now we're bringing in some traditions of like Hinduism. So, for example, the Guru Kripa tradition of grace of the Guru, maybe it was definitely unappealing to me when I was stuck in some of that libertarian free will. And now I just can't get enough of it. It's so beautiful to be here with you and other teachers. It's such a great gift. But then also, wanting to speak on, there's so many ways to go with this, but I'm thinking, what was the one I wanted to say, Seraphim? Yeah, but
another.
Maybe, go ahead.
Speaking of the Guru tradition, one tradition that I've really been enjoying the last couple of years is also the Sikh, because in the Sikh tradition, God, Ekonkar, that's how they refer to God, is considered Waheguru, so the ultimate guru. And the gurus who manifested from Waheguru are, you know, they're really kind of, I think it's a healthy approach to this guruship. And the great thing about the Sikh approach is the last guru is the text itself. It's the Adi Granth. So when you go into a Sikh Gurdwara, you are approaching the Guru itself in the form of the text there at the center of the Gurdwara. So I really appreciate that in terms of like talking about Guru traditions and relating traditions.
That's beautiful. Always, I really do enjoy your, Seraphim, your comparative approach. I find it extremely helpful. And I now have this beautiful image of the flower when I do go into these associations, like coming back to my core practice, because I can definitely do that a lot. And I find it very helpful. You know, as Jung talks about like an amplification of the core idea, I find that very helpful. And I'm wondering, I definitely want to come back to this purity thing, but this idea, I think it's very important. I mean, I was pinging for me and I want to make sure I understand it. This idea of like maybe tradition kind of descending, if I want to use that word, into a kind of conservatism or a kind of fundamentalism. And there's like this idea of like the further we get away from the initial revelation, the more it degrades, which I think is a core kind of presupposition of a lot of the fundamental ideas. This revelation happened, it's never going to happen, and we're just getting further away from it. And then there's this idea of like maybe of a lot of hubris we can have in modernity is like, that was dumb, you know, we've evolved, like they say like they're throwing the baby out with the bathwater, just throw everything out, and everything was garbage. I mean, we get these two polarized approaches, and it's very hard. I know that's one of our inspirations for creating this experience, because sometimes I'm really enmeshed in a beautiful traditional symbol set, and I just hear something that just, you know, throws my secular ethics into a tizzy. I'm like, I can't deal with this, and it's really jarring. And so bringing together these two perspectives, I think it's just really. I guess I just am speaking to how much it's resonating with me, and I'm thankful for your teachings in that. I guess maybe I want to check with you if I have the right view there.
One of the things I think we're trying to do in the Dini Ilahi is to understand that one of the greatest traditions, especially in terms of trying to incorporate traditions all together in a pluralistic way, one of the greatest traditions is the ethical tradition we've inherited from secular humanism and enlightenment. That too is a tradition. And what that can do, what we've learned from the great universalist values of humanism that have been bestowed to us from the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, is we can understand that there's a certain core of universal human values that we can all share that can unite us when we go back into our individual religious traditions. And that can be the bedrock for helping to transcend all of the cultural accretions and nonsense and violence and fundamentalism that's traditionally associated with traditionalist religion. So what you get with that is when you go into, and again, we're talking about not descending into ideology. So we don't want to speak about any of these things as isms, because anytime something becomes an ism, it becomes an ideology. And when it becomes an ideology, it's subject to idolatry. So for example, if I speak about non-duality, I'll never refer to it as non-dualism, because there's a danger there that we're going to sink into treating it as another ideology that we want to lift up as something to follow. Whereas that's exactly the opposite of what it is. So if we're talking about humanism, let's talk about this great tradition of secular humanism. As soon as we start to call it humanism, rather than our common humanity or the values we all share at the core for peace and nonviolence and tolerance, if we call it humanism, it'll become an ideology, which then will have to be counterposed against other ideologies. So I think it's important with tradition that we always speak of tradition and not traditionalism, and that we're willing to be open to the tradition even of secularity and atheism. Because atheism, or the atheist worldview, and actually atheism is the only ism I'll accept. You know why? Because I am an atheist to the sense that I'm not against God, I'm against theism. And so I'm all for atheism, because I don't think there should be such a thing as theism, because God is this, what did Meister Eckhart's great prayer was, I pray that God rid me of God. We're trying to get rid of this inherited notion, this kind of pastiche God, this sentimentalist God that people believed in, and get to the true reality of what's there. So in our approach to tradition, what we should be doing is looking for the living heart and the beauty and the truth and the goodness of that tradition that transcends any ideology we might want to turn it into.
Yeah, and that's also really beautiful, this idea of maybe integrating or embracing, first of all, kind of trying not to be ideological. It's so challenging. It's a great
It
challenge.
is. Well, that's where our mind goes. That
Yeah.
We want to create reification. What we attempt to do with the human mind is to reify ideas so that we can be secure with them. And this spiritual path is one in which we're always trying to completely destroy all reification so we can get to the truth. If you meet the Buddha on the road, kill him, because it's probably some kind of ideology about the Buddha rather than the Buddha himself.
Yeah, it's such a interesting perspective, like trying to transcend this ideology. I think of like Martin Buber's work with the I thou, and like really trying to read someone as and see them who they are, not objectify their work. And I think this, I don't know what you think of his work, but you share a namesake. Like Seraphim Rose writes really beautifully of Nietzsche, and how like he prefers Nietzsche a lot to like certain people in the church that he knows they're kind of lying, and he's like, at least Nietzsche is speaking the truth, and he's a great apostle actually to Christ, like because he's for Christ. And it's very kind of I hope I'm not this is in his book in Genesis, so someone please on Genesis, so someone please fact check me on this. I might be reading into Seraphim Rose's work, but anyways, I think it's a beautiful invitation towards integration, like reading, and maybe it's talking about our flower, like this idea of, I find the atheists, a lot of the atheism or the atheist thinkers, and people have drawn a genealogy like back to like pseudo Dionysus, and like the apophatic, right, is the negative,
right?
And
right.
atheism, atheist thinkers can be a great apophatic tool to kind of challenge some of our reified notions of what God is. I find them beautiful in that way, and I find it satisfying to really read them without attacking them, without fighting them. Like, let me receive your wisdom. But anyways, do you think this could be? We've talked about with Mary, or the Theotokos, Mary, the Mother of God, as we've talked about her as pure. This very interesting idea of you talking about purity. Is there a connection here with this idea of emptiness? I mean, we're talking about the atheists. What do you think of this particular feast day and the idea of the idea of emptiness? Is there anything coming up for you there?
Yeah, definitely. So the emptiness, again, goes back to the Greek word kenosis. Now, the Orthodox, we're very big on contexts, not contests, but on context or contextualization of holy ideas. So the allotropically, the Theotokos bears the same resemblance to Christ that the communion cup bears to the holy gifts within. This is why after an Orthodox Christian communes with the body and blood of Christ, we will then kiss the cup in the acknowledgement that we're not only partaking of the body and blood of Christ, but it was the context, that is the cup that was holding the holy gifts, that's also important as well. And that's how we speak of the Mother of God. We don't just worship Christ kind of alone, floating around in a vacuum. We understand that Christ had a whole context, and that context was this kind of crucible of purity and emptiness that is the Mother of God, from which the Logos, the eternal Logos, arose. Now, this has a kind of psychonoetic equivalent in as much as, well, it has both a psychonoetic equivalent and it has a moral equivalent. The psychonoetic equivalent is one in which you can't begin your meditation session, you can't start to depart in return unless you first find some kind of emptiness. Okay, so that nativity of the Theotokos, psychologically in meditation, or I should say noetically, represents that moment, that first moment in which you've kind of centered yourself in an emptiness from which you can then depart. Okay, so there's even some beautiful icons of the Theotokos in which she's holding Christ in the center of her being, in that kind of emptiness of herself. So the Logos, or the Word, the eternal Word, or the meaning, emerges from that emptiness. So that's the noetic equivalent. Morally, that purity comes from the fact that we cannot act ethically in the world, in our relationship to each other, without first establishing an inner purity and morality in ourselves. Okay, so we have to be good with ourselves first in terms of understanding our relationship with, the ultimate pure one, with God, and then we can go out and have ethical dealings. So again, you have this kind of, you can even draw an analogy where you have, noetically, you have meditative emptiness, and then the revelation of meaning. With, morally, you've got this moral purity, and that from that moral purity arises ethical behavior. And symbologically or archetypally, you have the Mother of God, who must be present, because only the pureness of this Logos of Christ can arise from this pure context or field. So there's a lot of different analogies you can draw symbolically to this kind of interplay or relationship between purity and righteousness, between meditative emptiness and the reception of meaning, and etc.
Wow, thank you, Seraphim. There's a lot there that's coming up in me. I think the first one I just want to kind of ping and was coming up is just this beautiful emptying as a kind of prerequisite for maybe compassionate and even effective social action or social justice.
Right.
I think it's no surprise that, some of our great social activists are Christian, liberation theology, etc., especially in America, but worldwide as well. But then I'm thinking just kind of on a meta level, like my experience of like having a conversation with you, or spiritual practice in general. There's the great, I believe it's a Zen story of someone who goes to a Zen teacher and they're like, please teach me, great master. And he starts, the teacher, they start pouring the tea, and they're just overfilling the cup, you know. And I guess the moral, it's kind of ruin it, is that, you know, you have to, I think he even says in the story, like, you have to come to me with an empty cup. You've been bouncing around teacher to teacher to teacher, come in empty. And just as I did an improv class, improv acting, and something they asked us to do was to wait until the person is done speaking to start thinking, to start formulating what you're going to respond. And it's absolutely terrifying. It's so scary. There's really nothing to be afraid of. I'm finding myself, just as we're talking, trying to like listen to you, you know, and not respond, especially since we're recording. And I think there is, so just to call it out, like the courage of Mary of the Theotokos, of emptying and accepting this responsibility. I think it's not small stuff. Like emptying is like dying, letting go, surrendering. It's not for the faint of heart. It's definitely very challenging for me. So I did want to see if you had any thoughts on the relationship between kind of emptying and courage.
Yeah, well, you know, in Kabbalah, the teaching is that the Creator only created one creature, and that creature was a creature whose essential nature is simply receptivity. Okay, so the kind of raw state of creation is one in which all creation is simply open. It has like an open, empty hand wanting to receive the bounty of life. This is something that philosophers like Spinoza talked about as conatus. Conatus is just the raw desire to be. This is really who we are, at the foundation of who we are, and actually the foundation of what everything is. All everything wants to do is just be. Even in a rock simply keeps repeating the molecular and, you know, atomic patterns that it's in because it wants to continue being the thing it is. A plant, of course, wants to continue being, it has this desire to be. An animal, a human especially. So that desire to be, this conatus, is a basic openness. It's an emptiness to receiving the life that we didn't create and we didn't make up. You know, it was given to us. This life force, wherever it comes from, it pours into our bodies, and it continues to make us be. And we desire that life force. We desire to keep being through our conatus. We never stop to think that desire opens up from an essential state of total emptiness. Because if there was no emptiness there by which our hands could simply open up and receive being, it would already be full, and we couldn't take in the life that's constantly streaming from the higher world, from the upper world, from the Creator, because we would already be full. And so the basic gesture of spirituality, which Mary totally exemplifies in her life, is this opening, this total receptivity to the miracle of being. This is what Mary models for us. This is why we exalt the Mother of God in the church, because she's the Mother of God. She's so open and so receptive and so empty that her emptiness can be filled by the pure and total beingness of God. That's what Mother of God means. It means your emptiness is so complete that you're able to be filled by the ultimate fullness.
Yeah, it's beautiful. I'm sensing that this kind of, fortunately, we have a whole year to work through this, but this kind of blooming emptiness of being is just, it cuts to so many spiritual questions that I have, you know, about true self, no self, this kind of yin yang dance of life. There's really a lot there. But I'm wondering, you know, we've been talking for a little over an hour. I'm hoping that we could explore the icon. Would you be willing to transition to a kind of explication of the icon?
Yeah, I have a page. I don't have much to say about the icon today. I just wanted to make a few comments about it because I looked at I think this is the OCA page. I'm not sure. I want to see if I can share it with you. Give me 1 second here. Share screen. Okay, so can you see this page?
Yes, beautiful.
And is it scrolling? Am I scrolling now for you?
You are.
Okay, good. Okay, that's going to work out better than the last one because the last one I couldn't scroll. Okay, so just a few things to touch base with the last icon we spoke of, and that was the icon of the Nativity of Christ. There's a really interesting kind of dance between the icon of Christ and the Nativity of Christ, the icon of the Nativity of the Mother of God, because certain elements are the same and certain elements are different. Let's just go through a few of those quickly so you can get the general idea. First of all, we know from the icon of the Nativity of Christ that Christ was born in the wilderness. And that there was an essential kind of emptiness that opened up in that cave, the image of the cave that was in the wilderness. Well, you see in the background of the Nativity of the Theotokos, she's born in a city. So she's born in a social context, which is really an interesting irony because Mary, the mother, is talking about moral purity, which we don't think of as necessarily social, whereas Christ is born in the wilderness, but Christ is the exemplar of ethical behavior, or kind of modeling what sin and righteousness are, and he's born in a place outside of society. And you see a few other things that kind of relate to the Nativity of Christ icon. You see that Mary is also in this kind of position in which we notice resemblances to the female womb from the source from which all life comes. We see a little baby down in the bottom right corner being bathed. And this is actually the Theotokos. So you have a kind of play of these are both the same figure. We have the Theotokos being bathed by the midwives, and we also have the Theotokos. Oh no, this is actually Anna. Sorry, this is the Theotokos' mother, Anna, her father. And none of this material actually comes from the Gospels. A lot of this information comes from a text called the Proto-Evangelion of James. I find it interesting and ironic that there is actually more written about Mary in the Islamic Quran than there is in the Bible or in the New Testament. And also in this icon of Mary, you have this is Anna, actually. This is the Theotokos, the baby's the Theotokos. You have a little crib. Similarly, in the Nativity of Christ, you had a crib, but this crib does not resemble so much a coffin as the crib in the Nativity of Christ. And this is just one variant. This is the icon of the Nativity of Theotokos. I think this is a Russian one. That looks like maybe a 16th century Russian version. And this looks like a Greek one. And a lot of the elements are the same. You can see that, we have, this is interesting. Look at this. The Theotokos in this depiction is almost identical with the way Christ was wrapped in swaddling clothes that also echo the death shroud and a coffin-like crib versus this kind of crib where the artist, the iconographer, decided not to make it look so coffin-like. So I think that probably this iconographer, whoever it was, I'm not sure, most of these iconographers were anonymous, but this iconographer and this Greek icon definitely wants to continue that imagery of the birth of this figure. You could even call it an egoic figure, wanting to resonate both life and death, whereas this first one is only speaking about kind of maybe even a more sentimental portrayal about life. And then there's a lot of other different depictions. This one looks like one that's on a wall, but you can see the symbology is all the same. Background in a city, the Theotokos being, washed, and this is also the Theotokos, I believe. So there's a lot more that could be said about those, but I think you get the general idea that I wanted to convey, which is that this icon of the Nativity of the Theotokos is a foreshadowing of the same symbolic elements that we're going to find in the icon of the Nativity of Christ for the feast day that's going to happen 3 months down the line. So in the feast days of the Orthodox Church, we're celebrating the Nativity of Theotokos, and then we'll celebrate the exaltation of the Holy Cross, and then the entrance of the Theotokos into the temple, and then the Nativity, which is, Christmas.
Awesome. Thank you, Seraphim. It's always so amazing to go through the icons. So a few of the core themes that I was seeing, and you were kind of explicating for us, is so this really interesting thing about Mary being born, the Mother of God being born in the city, and then
Right.
her in her developmental process, becoming kind of the exemplar, the type of moral purity, or the trope, I should say, of moral purity and acting from kind of within, and kind of we're seeing, and it seems like it's very, very important for us to continue to kind of circle to these kind of the parallax vision, as you were talking about, is comparing them and contrasting them with like Christ's journey, being born in the manger, being born in the cave, this idea of being born in the wilderness, and kind of rising to ethical, being a paragon of ethical action.
Right.
So that's a big theme from these icons, you'd say.
And yeah, also interesting that apparently, according to the Proto-Evangelion anyway, Joachim, Mary's father, is supposed to be a rich man. So she comes from a very wealthy family, whereas, you know, the family of Jesus was a poor family, Joseph, the poor carpenter, and Mary. So there's another interesting kind of, you know, parallax view.
Very cool. And then also just to recognize this idea of maybe seekers, Christians watching this, you know, check out the Quran on Mary. That's really, really, really cool. And our Islamic siblings have so much to offer us, especially on this at this time of the year.
Yeah.
So that's, yeah.
Well, the really beautiful thing about, you know, the Din Ilahi and the pluralistic approach is that you begin to see how so much opens up in all of the traditions. So in the same way that, you know, if we could conceptualize, for example, the anatomical or the astronomical patterns that are given us by the interplay of the sun and the moon and the earth, and the way that we can see, for example, in the moon. When we look up at the moon, we see both the sun and the earth, because we see the sun being reflected and we see the earth shadowing, right? And so the moon for us is this kind of this intersection, or this there's kind of, I guess you could say, an intersectionality with the moon. So I think about the images given to us in the Torah, or the Tanakh, the Jewish scriptures, and the Christian scriptures, and the Islamic scriptures, as presenting that kind of a play. Because, for example, in the Jewish scriptures, you know, we have no images of Jesus or Mary, because all of that was written long before that. So we have a kind of pure view upon God. And there's a lot of other things that could be said here. But if you look in the Quran then, or sorry, if you look in the New Testament, then you get an image, you know, a full revelation of who Christ is, but not really much about Mary. But then when you look at the Quran, you have a full view of God. But again, you only have partial images of Mary and Jesus. But Jesus and Mary are still mentioned a lot in the Quran. So if you're involved in this parallax view, trying to see the whole picture, the contributions from each of the texts give you a much fuller picture than you would otherwise receive from reading any one scripture individually, you know, or in an exclusivist way.
Right. Yeah. And there's also there, I mean, growing up with the kind of Christian symbols, it's almost like it can just be like such a jolt. Like they're like, as I'm reading some of the material from the great the deposit of Hindu religion, it's just like incredible. And they're just, I see more coming back to the Christian stories. It feels like a defibrillator to the soul or something like that. Reading some of those, and so it's definitely and looking into, as you're saying, as we have the freedom to look, pull from different traditions, open to their immense wisdom, and then incorporate that in our kind of integral view.
Yes, absolutely. That's what's beautiful about it. I just wish more people were to open to understanding. I mean, the whole mission of what I'm doing is trying to open up those doors, open up those windows, allowing people to see more and more that there's no reason anymore for the old forms of exclusivism and isolationism, and, you know, my way is better than your way, because all of the traditions And all of the wisdom of those traditions open up so much more when we're able to share and appreciate and get the parallax view and triangulate the wisdom. And, you know, I see kind of like every world tradition is kind of the Rashomon effect, right? And the Rashomon effect is where, you know, everybody's telling a different version of the same story. And this is what all the traditions are doing. And we should just kind of learn to understand that there's this transcendental object beyond space and time out there that most people call God, that we can get a fuller view of if we just start sharing each other's stories.
Absolutely. Beautiful, beautiful. And so I'm loving that. Maybe we can circle back to your work with Dylan Ahi. I'm sorry, my pronunciation. How do we say it again?
Dini Ilahi.
Dini Ilahi. Beautiful.
Dini
Yeah, maybe we can circle back to that at the end and give people a clear call to action on how they can get involved in that. But I'm wondering if maybe we could, I know just personally, and I've gotten some feedback from the audience on this too, that in our last session, the imaginal kind of reverie and approach that kind of opens up with icon contemplation was very rewarding and very kind of interesting practice for a lot of folks. I'm wondering, maybe I'll say what I'm planning on doing in between our sessions, kind of working with these icons imaginally. What could that look like for folks, or how is that kind of, how have you done something like that? How has it been done contemplatively before? Maybe just throwing out some ideas, brainstorming on how we could work with these images in between feast days.
Yeah, well, if you want to do it holistically, you would have to really want to do it within the pattern of, you know, an integrated pattern that the traditional Orthodox Church gives you. So during a feast day in the Orthodox Church, the festal icon is always put in the middle of the sanctuary. And so it's an object of contemplation for everybody that arrives to celebrate that feast day to come and venerate and to contemplate as they're praying. So my best suggestion would be to find an Orthodox church, and I'm kind of taking a risk here because a lot of Orthodox churches are not worth their salt, but if anybody could possibly, for example, go to San Anselmo in California and visit St. Nicholas Orthodox Church, probably the greatest Orthodox priest in the Orthodox Church in America is there, Father Stefan Mihalik. And there's other great Orthodox churches, but I mean, I would not advise simply tearing an icon outside of the context of the liturgy, because icons were always painted and presumed and assumed to be part of that living liturgical context. That's how you're going to get the most out of any icon, particularly the festal icons of the 12 great feasts.
Okay, so maybe find a divine liturgy and check it out on that day. And
find a divine liturgy, find out what the feast day is, or the saint being celebrated that day, and try to become aware of the hymnography and the iconography that's related to the theme of that feast day. Because, you know, unlike many other churches that I can think of, particularly Protestant churches, you would walk into a church and you would have no notion whatsoever that this is a different day of the week than any other. Whereas for any Orthodox church, you're walking into actually a whole kind of living diorama of the holy meaning and purpose of that particular day. You're sort of walking into it and seeing it all around you in the iconography, hymnography, and liturgical action. So definitely go to an Orthodox church and find out what the feast is, what they're celebrating, and try to immerse yourself in the contemplation of those images and words and sounds, rather than getting distracted with your ordinary everyday thoughts. Because the point of walking into an Orthodox church is, when you walk into the church, you're putting aside your quotidian reality. You're putting aside your normal, distracted everyday life, and you're walking into an environment, a symbological environment, by which you're replacing mundane ideas with sacred ideas. And the sacred ideas are given to you through the archetypes and symbols of the liturgy. And the more you do this, the more you engage in this process of replacing your ordinary everyday thoughts and habits and emotions with these kind of uplifted, exalted, holy archetypes, the more you become God. That's the process of theosis. The process of theosis is replacing old, tired, mundane, habitual thoughts with holy, sacred thoughts that are part of the general living organism of the church.
Yeah, and it's so beautiful. So I think that was a really good, that felt like a really helpful understanding of some of the benefits of going to divine liturgy, if possible. Maybe I'll just brainstorm some other ideas for whatever reason that isn't accessible to you. That's our best option, but if it isn't accessible, I was thinking as you're reading of kind of Iliade's work on sacred space.
Yep.
And just what that means. And I want to invite folks like to really linger on this maybe, and I'm trying to linger on it too. So Evelyn Underhill talks a lot about in
Yes.
the book on mysticism, on the relationship between, because I kind of lean more to the mystical side. It's like, church, like I want to be a contemplative, but really opening up to the relationship between the mystical and the.
Well, that's the thing about the Orthodox Church, though, Brian. The liturgy is mystical. In the Orthodox Church, it's not like mystical versus liturgy. The liturgy is the doorway to the mystical.
Right.
Yeah.
And so maybe like just revisiting those ideas about what it means to witness liturgy kind of consciously.
Right. Exactly.
And if it's not available to you, maybe reading up on sacred space, exploring ritual. I've at times followed the Benedictines book, this big brown book. It's amazing, but it's Liturgy of the Hours, which can be a really beautiful ritual.
Yeah.
And things like this could be helpful maybe for folks.
I would say, for me, the next best thing after the liturgy is find the recordings of Arvo Pärt. Arvo Pärt is the greatest liturgical composer, probably to my mind, of all time. For me, I have an instant mystical experience when I listen to any track of Arvo Pärt's. We can put that in our document as well.
Absolutely. Okay.
Yeah.
Beautiful. Okay. So I'm thinking we've been speaking exactly 90 minutes. I feel like that it's flown by. It's been extremely helpful. So I wanted to share gratitude for you for offering your time and wisdom to us. I'm wondering if you would say a little bit more about your work with your comparative approach. Maybe say a few sentences on the plural, the kind of movement that you've helped birth with pluralism, and how people maybe could get involved in that. Do you want to say a little bit about that?
Sure. It's called the Din Ilahi, which just means the divine faith, and it's kind of a meta-modern revival of a movement that the great Emperor Akbar the Great, 16th century Indian emperor, tried to initiate when he tried to get Hindus, Sufis, Christians, Jews, Sikhs, and some other religionists involved in a conversation together. The Din Ilahi is kind of a refashioning of that, but it's not simply an organization for interfaith dialogue. What it really is, it's kind of, I would call, the best description would be it's a meta religion, because in the meta religion of the Din Ilahi, the participants are remaining within their own tradition, but they're also encouraged to take on other traditions. So, for example, for myself, I'm a practicing Christian, Jew, and Muslim. Okay, I consider myself to be all three. Because again, what you're doing when you're practicing more than one tradition is you're getting a parallax view on that, that elephant that the blind men are trying to feel them. The more aspects of this elephant that you can discover, the more facets that you can discover, the better off you are. And that's what the Din Ilahi is. It's an organization where we can come together and share our pluralistic multi-faith experiences. So I might be a Muslim, a Jew, and a Christian talking to someone who, in the Eastern traditions, well, by the way, this is not at all strange. If you take a country like China and Japan, it's completely acceptable for somebody to be a Buddhist, a Taoist, and a Shinto, practitioner of Shinto, all at the same time. In fact, they often say they get married in a Christian church, but they get buried in a Buddhist burial. I mean, in the East, it's not at all strange to say something like, I'm a multiple religionist. It's only in the West where we have this notion that you should be exclusive in your religious pursuits that it seems an odd thing. So basically, that's what the Din Ilahi is. It's a place where multi-religionists or people of multi-faith can come together, share their ideas, exchange notes, and come to a greater view of wisdom than they would otherwise have by sticking in just one narrow-minded tradition and in one way.
Lovely, lovely. And I think that that adds a lot of context for folks when we're talking about like kind of really trying to, as we're practicing this orthodox expression of wisdom, to really stay faithful to it and have some fidelity to that tradition. Because it's, in my experience with your work and with the folks when we gather together, it's like this beautiful, there's a depth and a width. We're not necessarily wanting to be dilettantes. We're wanting to like really go wide and then also go deep as an expression of the beauty of these traditions. And I think that.
Yeah, I really actually, what I'd like to really say, it's very important. I think we understand that we begin breaking out of our usual metaphors about what it means to be faithful to a tradition. So in the Din Ilahi, we're really trying to emphasize that it's possible to be faithful to one tradition and to engage and be faithful in another, in the same way that a musician in an orchestra can be an excellent violinist and an excellent pianist. Now, you're not going to play the violin and you're not going to play the piano at the same time. Just like when I go into an Orthodox church, I'm not going to say Islamic prayers. Or when I go into a mosque, I'm not going to say Jewish prayers. So in an orchestra, if you're a pianist, you're going to play the piano, but maybe at the next concert, you're going to play the violin because you're good at both, okay? Or another great analogy, you can read multiple novels at the same time. I can read Moby Dick and Crime and Punishment and Anne of Green Gables all at the same time, and I'm not going to get the characters mixed up. I'm not going to get the plots mixed up, and I'm not going to get the basic worldview of each novel mixed up, because I know Anne of Green Gables is this, Moby Dick is this, and Crime and Punishment is this. This is what multi-religiosity is. When you go into a religious venue, when you walk into a mosque, or you walk into a synagogue, or you walk into a Christian church, you are being and believing and belonging to that. And then when you walk out of it, you get whatever experience you've had from it, you enrich yourself by it, and then go on with your multi-faith life.
Yeah, and so I mean, do you think that perspective, that's really why maybe it's important to talk about the meta perspective?
Right.
Because if you're not taking that meta perspective, maybe it would be more relative, perhaps.
Well, it's certainly, it's not relativistic at all. What it is, again, committing yourself to one particular religion is like committing yourself to reading only one novel throughout your life, because you feel like you're going to betray Moby Dick if you ever read any other novel in the world. Which, no, it's not relativism. What it is, what I call it is interstructive theology. Interstructive. Okay, so currently there's a movement in theology called, I think that it's John Tatanamil writes about it, structuralist theology, I think, or constructive theology, that's what it's called. But with the interstructive theology, what you're doing is you're really, you're not relativizing each tradition. You're enriching your view of whatever particular tradition you're looking at by getting that parallax view again. That parallax view is very important because the truth, this is the one great discovery of the Din Ilahi, the truth cannot be told directly. The truth is not such a thing that can be expressed in a proposition, such as, the sun rises in the east, or 2 + 2 = 4. That kind of propositional logic and propositional truth is good for, earthly mundane realities. But when you're speaking about metaphysics, and when you're speaking about metaphysical realities, you're entering into a trans-propositional realm of truth. So it has to be addressed in a different way. So I don't think either the words relativism or absolutism apply. So I'm really trying to search for a language or a way of articulating this kind of more harmonic, orchestrated. I would call it, the best thing I would call is, I'd call it symphonic. I would say it's a symphonic approach to world religions, Just in the same way that you can go in and be a different kind of musician and be an expert. Or another perfect analogy is language. You know, I can be a Russian, an Arabic, and a Chinese speaker, and I'm not going to get the languages mixed up, but I'm not going to speak to you in Chinese while I'm speaking to you in English. It's, you know, there's so many like beautiful analogies. I would call the way people can speak different languages to be symphonic. And the more languages you know, the better. The more religions you practice, the better. The more instruments you can play in an orchestra, the better. The more restaurants you're free to go to. I'm allowed to go to a Chinese restaurant and be nourished by Chinese food tonight and be nourished by Italian food tomorrow. The only person who would tell me that I couldn't be nourished by Italian food tomorrow is a monopolist Chinese restaurant owner who wants me to eat only at his restaurant because he's got a monopoly on that kind of nourishment. Same thing with religions. The leaders of religions will tell you, oh, no, no, no. We have a monopoly on truth in this particular church, and you must only be nourished by the truth here. But the reason they're telling you that is because they have something to gain by your absolute and total loyalty. The fact is, you can eat at any darn restaurant you want to get your nourishment, and you can go to any church you want to get your spiritual nourishment. In fact, you're probably going to be nourished even better because you're getting a variety rather than just the same spiritual food night after night.
Yeah, definitely. Amen to that. It's you know, something I talked about early in our conversation was this idea of like permaculture versus monoculture, like diversity.
Right.
Diversity is
Totally.
an amazing thing. And
yeah, most people want you to simply accept spiritual monoculture. It makes sense. And spiritual monoculture is, I would consider to be fatal
and boring.
And boring.
Yeah. Okay, and then also maybe just to again to come full circle, like very on a meta level, is this beautiful? Well, first of all, thank you for your 3, I think, analogies of or was it 4? Eating, language, music, and novels. I mean, I think.
Well, I'm writing a book called 101 Analogies for Pluralism because there are so many, Brian. Yeah. There are. So if you sit down and think about it, God loves nothing more than variety. Yeah. If you look around the world, the diversity of cultures, of languages, of flowers, of plants, of animals, of everything. Why is it that everything in reality is diverse except religion? Right? So I'm writing a book, 101 different, analogies to the enrichment of pluralism. I don't know what I'm going to call it yet, but it's something like that. Yeah, it just feels to me that I love that. And I'm excited to read it. It just feels to me that we're circling around. Many of us have had this, if we're so blessed, this experience of true love, of love and connection. And we're all circling around those experiences, chanting words and adjectives at it. And that's fine. There's nothing wrong. The more the better. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I wonder if that's a good place to stop. Is there anything else that you'd like to leave us with today? No, I think whatever more I have to say, we'll continue in the next one, I hope. Okay, and maybe that's good. Just as for, first of all, just a thank you to everyone who's viewing us. Thank you for, no matter, as we've talked about today, time is we're moving in spirals, and no matter when you're watching it, you're with us, and we appreciate your presence. We'll be continuing this series. Maybe you're some point in the future from where we're at, and you can watch them all in a row. Or maybe you're watching with us as we go. And so we look forward to doing that. And so stay tuned. There'll be some resources in the description, like this Google Doc we've been talking about, and maybe some links to Seraphim as well. So thank you so much, Seraphim, for blessing us with your wisdom, and I will talk to you soon. Thank you. Thanks.